Hello, this is After the Oligarchy. Today we're talking about Another Now, a proposal for a post-capitalist society. In 2020, Yanis Varoufakis, Professor of Economics, former Greek Finance Minister, co-founder of DiEM25, General Secretary of Merit25 and Member of Parliament in Greece, published the book Another Now, Dispatches from an Alternative Present. The book discusses an alternate history where humanity broke with capitalism after the 2008 financial crisis. It's a brilliant book, highly readable, inventive, and likely to appeal to a general audience, so I recommend that you read it. In this talk today, I'm going to present an abstract summary of the model found in those pages. Before we begin though, I want to make a few things clear. Firstly, this is not a summary of the book Another Now. Another Now is written in a science fiction format with a lot of dialogue between characters who have different opinions. So I'm only going to present that alternate reality here. Secondly, this is only a summary of the economic model of Another Now. I'm not going to discuss activism, strategy, and transition. Thirdly, this isn't a review, analysis, or critique. I will only provide an exposition of the model. So those are topics for another day. Lastly, this is a detailed presentation. I have emphasized accuracy and completeness. However, this talk will be very clear and will make extensive use of pictures, so it won't just be an hour of black text on a white background. If you follow, you'll understand, and by the end you'll be an expert in Another Now. If you need to take a break, do that. This isn't university. Now, before we dive into the details, I want to quickly give you the gist of Another Now. It's a kind of socialism. There's a big emphasis on properly functioning markets, on worker self-management, on radically reforming finance, especially through a public payment system, on international economic institutions, on the public ownership of land, on digital data rights, and there is extensive use of sortition for regulation and governance. And if you haven't come across that word, this means picking people at random. You can use many different words: sortition, lottery, by lot. Effectively, it means picking people by random. And this is the technique which was used predominantly in the Athenian democracy. So here are the main headings for the talk. I grouped the proposals in Another Now into 7 main categories: production units, regulation, finance, digital information, land, immigration, international trade and development. And now we'll go through them in order. One last thing, I just want to give you a global picture of the model. Here you have land publicly owned, governed by these county associations, immigration happening on a regional basis, the central bank having a very important role, public payment system, private credit system, each resident having an account at the central bank broken into 3 different sections, production units with a nationalized sector, worker-owned sector, and a domestic economy, and these production units being regulated by social accountability juries, and then various institutions which regulate use of data. Also, there's a relation between the national state and other states through the International Monetary Project. Don't worry, I don't expect you to understand this. I'm just trying to give you a global picture of the entire system before we look into each of these individual facets in detail, which is exactly what we're going to do now, starting with production units. So let's first look at ownership and exchange. You've got a nationalized sector. There's no share market. So this means, let's say there's a furniture company and I don't work at that furniture company. I cannot purchase a share in that company because there's no share market. There's no stock market, if you're more familiar with the word stock. Only the people who work in that furniture company can own shares in it. So apart from the nationalized sector, the rest of production is primarily divided into worker-owned firms. And these worker-owned firms engage in commodity production. That is, they produce goods and services for market exchange. These firms do not pay wages. They only give returns to capital to the workers. We'll go into that later. The economy uses money, and this is money as we'd recognize it. It's not labor tokens, labor time. It's just money. Production units, as I said, are divided into a nationalized sector. This is only briefly mentioned in passing in the book. He says that utilities were nationalized. Usually utilities refer to things like sewage, electricity, rubbish collection, and so forth. Does this apply to health, education, transport, and energy in Another Now? I'm not exactly sure. Given what I know about Varoufakis' politics, I would say that these things would also be nationalized, but putting a question mark on that. We have the worker-owned firm sector, which we're going to go into detail soon. And then you have the domestic economy. And the domestic economy isn't discussed really in the book, but I'm just putting it here to show that it actually does exist. By domestic economy, I mean what? I mean, if you wash your dishes in the sink, if you take care of a family member, this is all occurring within the domestic economy. Let's look at the ownership structure of one of these worker-owned firms. This firm is divided into 4 shares. The ownership of that firm is divided into 4 shares, and there are 4 workers. So there's 1 share per worker. So we have a situation where there's one worker having one share, which entitles that worker to one rate of basic pay and one vote in matters of the firm. Disjointedness criterion, we'll come to that later. That's about who gets to have a share and who doesn't. Now let's look at the income of worker one in one of these worker-owned firms. So the income of worker one is divided into two main fractions, basic pay and bonus. Basic pay will most likely make up the vast majority of their pay. So let's say that's something like €50,000. How is the basic pay determined? Well, there's a fund for basic pay for the whole firm, and then that is just divided completely equally between all the workers. So if there's a basic pay fund of €1 million and there are 10 workers and hence 10 shares, then each worker will receive a basic pay of €100,000. The bonus, however, is variable. In principle, worker one could get no bonus, or they could get the entire bonus fund to themselves. How is the bonus determined? Well, the bonus that worker one receives will be proportional to the amount of merit points that they're allocated. Merit points are essentially brownie points, which worker one receives from their colleagues. Really how this works is, again, there's a bonus fund for the whole firm, which just is decided democratically. The amount of bonus that worker one gets is proportional to how many merit points they get. So if worker one gets 5% of the merit points, they're going to get 5% of the total pot, which is set aside for the bonus. Now, one question which Varoufakis addresses is what stops, say, you and I from making a secret agreement that you're going to give me all your merit points, I'll give you all my merit points, and we'll get two big juicy bonuses. There is some information system that everybody in the firm can see, and it'll show who is giving whom merit points. So you can see here the lines indicate merit points being transferred from one worker to the other, and the number of merit points exchanged is shown as the thickness of the line. You see here that there are very thick lines going around in a circle between worker 1, 2 and 3. That indicates that there may be something untoward happening. So this makes the allocation of bonuses more transparent. There's a corporation tax which every firm must pay, and that is a tax on revenue, not profits. Corporation taxes today tend to be on profits. Just note that revenue is much larger than profit. Varoufakis gives a nominal figure of 5%. After paying this tax, there'll be revenue to divvy up between the company's activities, and that'll be split into fixed costs, research and development, basic pay and bonuses, the allocation of which will be decided by an all-member vote. All issues of strategic importance will be decided by an all-member vote. The after-tax revenue, after corporation tax revenue, fixed costs, R&D, basic pay and bonuses decided by an all-member vote. Firstly, by all-member vote, what do I mean? I mean everybody who has a share in the company. So all of the workers in the company who own a share vote. Vote on what? Any of those workers can put forward a business plan for the company, and that'll be voted on by everybody else, using ranked choice voting. And if you don't know what ranked choice voting is, look it up on Wikipedia. Similarly, for any issues of strategic importance, an all-member vote. There's a flat management structure. There are no bosses. There's no formal hierarchy within the firm. And as far as I can tell, there are no managers at all, not even elected managers. Organization is fluid. People can choose to work on whatever projects they want. And Varoufakis says that firms would typically be small. They would typically have less than 300 staff due to the absence of share market. So a very flat management structure. Hiring ultimately requires an all-member vote. So does firing. And the disjointedness criterion, we'll discuss that momentarily. So if I want to bring somebody into the firm, let's say I want to hire you and make you a full member of the co-op with a share, that needs to be approved by everybody. I can't just bring in 10 of my mates into the company and they all get shares, because that would dilute the basic pay of everybody else. Similarly for firing, that requires an all-member vote. Now, who gets a share? This is where the so-called disjointedness criterion enters. Now, in the book, a couple examples are given to illustrate this topic. The first is a plumber fixes a pipe. Should that plumber be given a share in the company because they fixed that pipe, or should they be given a one-off fee for the service that they provide? The second is a cafe that's owned and run by two people. They want to bring in an additional waiter. Should they pay that waiter wages, or should that waiter get a share in the company? To resolve this issue, the so-called disjointedness criterion is introduced. This is used, quote, to distinguish between value production that requires teamwork and value that can be created and measured individually, end quote. So in the end, it's decided that the plumber would be paid a one-off fee and the waiter would be given a share. Regulation. To compensate for some of the vagaries of the market, a social worthiness index is used. This is an index which is meant to go beyond mere exchange value, beyond mere market price, and to incorporate human flourishing, community, sustainable relationship with the biosphere, and so forth. This social worthiness index is used by citizens' juries, which judge companies. And if the companies fall below a certain threshold, then action can be taken. These social accountability juries, as I've called them because it's a less ambiguous name, there's one jury per company. Company 1 has jury 1, company 2 has jury 2, company 3 has jury 3 associated with it. Periodically, each of these juries will provide a social rating using the social worthiness index of their designated company. So let's look at one of these juries and one of these companies. So jury 1 is associated with company 1. Who goes on jury 1? When the company is registered legally, a stakeholder community is formed. So what's a stakeholder community? Well, this will be customers, people affected by the firm in some way. This stakeholder community exists online. It's a digital stakeholder community. And to form the jury, people are chosen at random from this stakeholder community, okay, using a lottery. There's some algorithm to try to ensure fair participation by different groups throughout society, but effectively it's done at random. Also, the jury is formed on a regional basis. It pertains to a particular area. Periodically, jury 1 will rate company 1. And this rating will be using the social worthiness index, which will be standardized. It won't be a case that each jury will be making its own idiosyncratic measurement. There'll be a standardized system for the whole country. If that company falls below a certain threshold on that index, let's say company 1 is dumping toxic chemicals into a local river, a public inquiry will be held. And that inquiry will be empowered to deregister company 1, either through dissolving the company entirely or putting it to tender. So some other person or group can have the opportunity to operate that company and use its assets. And the idea is that the mere threat even of social accountability juries being able to dissolve companies will keep them in check. But if push comes to shove, they can be dissolved. Finance. We're going to consider 4 topics: tax, the central bank, private credit, and local currency. So tax, in another now, is very simple. There are 2 taxes, corporation tax and land tax. That's it. There are no other taxes. And as said, corporation tax is on revenue, not profit. Land tax, we're going to discuss that when we talk about land in detail. Now, this is very important. Every resident has an account at the central bank. Well, what does that mean? Today, you and I don't have accounts at the central bank. We can only get an account at a private bank, and in turn, that private bank will have an account at the central bank. So that's the difference. That account is called your personal capital, or per cap for short. Please remember that terminology. It's going to come up again and again. That can generate interest. Your per cap is divided into accumulation, legacy, and dividend. So let's look at that. Every resident has an account at the central bank. And you have a per cap account, which is divided into accumulation, legacy, and dividend. So what are those things? These 3 accounts are walled off from each other. They're separate and they have distinct functions. Accumulation is like your normal account. That's where your work income goes from your share and your bonus. Your interest income will go there if you lend out money to other people and companies, and anything else will go there, such as if you sell your car to somebody, the money you get from selling your car will go into accumulation. Next, legacy is a trust fund. Everybody gets that. It's large, so in the book, the figure of $100,000 is given. And while everybody gets it, you can only access it if you jump through certain hoops. So firstly, you have to be an adult and you have to have a plan for its use. The next account is dividend. This is basic income. This is universal basic income. It's a monthly stipend, which everybody gets. The book says it's age-related. Not exactly sure what that means. I think it means you can only get it if you're an adult. Why is it called dividend and not universal basic income? It's a rhetorical spin which says that This is a dividend that you're receiving from the total capital of society, which you're entitled to because you are a member of that society and you contribute to the capital of society in some immeasurable way. This is the same information presented another way. Now, the central bank is governed by a citizens' monetary assembly, and this is appointed randomly and rotated. So there's a central bank charter which this citizens' monetary assembly will try to implement. How is this assembly appointed? In a pattern that will become very familiar. There is a pool of residents in the country. The monetary assembly is drawn from that pool using a lottery. So everybody in the country will have some chance of being appointed to the citizens' monetary assembly with an algorithm that takes account of the representation of different groups. We saw the central bank as a charter. In that charter is an inflation target. So the central bank has an inflation target. Let's say that's 3% per year, for example. Now, let's say that inflation is running at 20% per year. What does the central bank do? The central bank will then increase the interest rate accruing to per cap accounts, so your account at the central bank. Equally, if the inflation target is 3% and inflation is running at 0%, the interest rates can be decreased. Also, the dividend which each person is awarded in their per cap account can be increased. In principle, this could also be decreased. What I gather is that increasing and decreasing interest rates would be the first resort, and fiddling with the amount of dividend would be the second resort. Now, the central bank operates a public payment system called Jerome, named after Saint Jerome, the patron saint of libraries. This is very important. It runs on something like blockchain, which allows transactions to be private, but the total amount of money in the system to be transparent. Also, there are no service charges or fees. So if I send you money, there's no fee for that. This is a public service rendered by the central bank. So we see that here. The Jerome public payment system being operated by the central bank using some kind of blockchain ledger. Transactions are anonymous. There are no fees, but the total amount of money in the system is transparent. The point of that is to stop the central bank from being able to give trillions and trillions to their mates without anybody knowing. Now, credit. Any individual can lend their per cap, peer-to-peer, through an intermediary, or through a credit union. There are no equity loans, so loans are only for interest. And all of these changes, i.e. the use of the public payment system, has made other financial vehicles obsolete. Your retail banks, commercial banks, investment banks, these have been made obsolete. I put a question mark here on the role of public banking in investment. We see that public banking has a very important function in terms of a payment system, in terms of your per cap account, the legacy, the dividend. But what role public banking has directly in investment, investing in the means of production, I'm not sure. This isn't discussed in the book as far as I can tell. Now, we see here the public payment system Jerome, again operated by the central bank. These are all individual per cap accounts at the central bank. People can lend to each other, peer-to-peer. Companies. How do companies obtain credit? Well, there's a couple of ways. Individuals can lend directly to companies, so this individual is lending directly to company 2, or individuals can lend to companies through intermediaries. See here, intermediary 1, intermediary 2. These intermediaries are your trading apps, Robinhood, DeGiro, etc. You can also see here that companies can lend to each other. Furthermore, individuals can pool their per cap to form a credit union, and in turn, this credit union can lend to individuals and it can lend to companies. Important to note is that these credit unions operate strictly on a loanable funds model. What does this mean? If credit union 1 is going to make a loan of €10,000 to company 3, it can only do that if there have already been deposits made equaling €10,000. Don't banks already do this? No. Banks today operate on a fractional reserve system where private banks actually create money essentially whenever they issue loans. So if this was a private bank today, it would make a loan to company 3 of €10,000 regardless of of the value of deposits it had already accumulated. Furthermore, another important point is that if Credit Union 1 makes a loan to Company 3, this is not an equity loan. It cannot take a stake in Company 3. This is because there's no share market. Only workers in Company 3 can own shares in Company 3. So Credit Union 1 can make a loan of €10,000 to Company 3, but it can only do this to make interest on that loan. Right, local currencies. So we've seen Jerome, the public payment system operated by the central bank, the digital payment system. These digital tools will be provided to any group who wants to make a local currency. This results in local governments issuing local currency. Why would they do that? Well, to keep value in the locality. Exchange rates are set by the central bank, I think, and these exchange rates are used to regulate the flow of wealth between regions. Here you have a state, the central bank, public payment system, and the national currency. You also have other regions issuing their own local currencies. So look at Region 1. Region 1 basically creates its own local version of Jerome, Local Payment System 1. And using this, it creates Local Currency 1. This is a digital currency. Similarly for Region 2, for Region 3. Now, there's an exchange rate between each of these local currencies and the national currency. And this will be set by the central bank. So if we look at the exchange between local currency 1 and the national currency, this is set at 2. So let's say 1 unit of local currency will fetch 2 units of national currency. And these numbers can be manipulated to regulate the flow of wealth between regions. So let's say Region 1 is quite deprived compared to the rest of the country. You'd make it expensive to convert local currency 1 into national currency to encourage people in Region 1 to keep value locally, to stimulate investment and consumption locally, to try to promote development there. The corollary of this would be that it would be cheap for national currency to be converted into local currency. So money would flow from the surrounding economy into Region 1, again promoting development. Digital information. There's a Digital Rights Act. This legislates full property rights for personal data. There's a micropayment system called Penny for Your Thought. So to use your data, app developers must get your consent and pay you. This in turn stimulates a new business model where users actually pay to use apps because the user becomes the customer rather than the product. There's also a sovereign data fund. All data, public and private, is stored anonymously on sovereign data fund servers. To use this data, companies pay a royalty for a license. Why do this? To harness economies of scale. Certain things can only be done with huge pools of data, so-called big data. So that's the purpose of the Sovereign Data Fund. Let's look at this in more detail. You have developer 1 trying to develop some application. They can access the Sovereign Data Fund, pay a royalty and access that data. That royalty goes to the state. The Sovereign Data Fund is part of the state. What if developer 1 wants to use your data specifically? I've listed a number of individuals here, person 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And for each of these people, there's many different kinds of data. So data 1, 2, 3 through N. So let's say data 1 is health data, data 2 is location data, data 3 is purchasing preferences, etc. These are all different types of data. Developer 1 has to go through this micropayment system, Penny for Your Thought. Before they purchase anything, they have to obtain your consent. And they have to obtain your consent for every different type of data. So let's look at person 1. Person 1 does not give consent for data 3, but they do give consent for all of the other kind. Person 2 does not consent for any of their data to be used. So developer 1 will not be able to access any of person 2's data. And similarly, you can look at person 3, 4, etc. Each person can make their own preferences. Now, person 1 has consented to some of their data being used. So for that data, developer 1 has to pay. So developer 1 sends money to person 1 and person 1 sends data to developer 1. Now, looking at this transaction, it's unlikely that person 1 will obtain very much money from this transaction. However, if you look at things from the perspective of developer 1, who might be trying to obtain data from 10,000 people, that could become expensive very quickly. So you could see how this would incentivize a different business model, where users actually become customers who have to pay for things and stop being the product, because data is not available as a free resource. Land. But first, this video is sponsored by NSO Group. Guys, spying on activists and journalists can be a thankless job, I know that. which takes your precious quality time away from trafficking children and embezzling public funds. That's why the Israeli technology company NSO Group developed Pegasus. Pegasus is the hands-free panopticon for the 21st century oligarch, which can hoover up all a device's data and operate the microphone and camera with 0 clicks. That's fully automated luxury something or other. Guys, order Pegasus today. Visit nsogroup.com/Pegasus and use the promo code AFTERTHEOligarchy20 for 20% off your first order. And of course, guys, if you like this video so far, imagine you're the US empire, Iraq is the like button, Afghanistan is the subscribe button, and you'll know what to do. Now, back to the video. So in another now, all land is publicly owned, all of it, and it's owned on a regional basis by regional ground commons authorities. And these are called GCOMs for short. So please remember GCOMs, that's going to come up several times. This land is zoned into different areas, and each land authority is governed by a county association, which is responsible for zoning and social housing. So here's the land in an entire country. It's divided into regions. Each region has its own GCOMs, its own Ground Commons Authority, and each GCOMs is governed by its own county association. Now, who sits on this county association? Well, you'd probably guess by now, there's a pool of local residents and they're appointed using a lottery system. Let's look at what this county association does in more detail. So the county association is responsible for zoning land. Land is zoned into 2 main zones, social and commercial. Social, I think, is broken into residential and other. I'm a little bit unclear about this, but it doesn't really matter. There's certainly a residential section anyway. Commercial land is further zoned into residential and business zones. And all commercial occupants must pay a rent to GCOMs, the local land authority. Let's look at the social zone. So there's a residential and an other section. Occupants in the social zone don't have to pay any rent. And social housing is allocated by the county association. So we look at that now. This is a social zone within a particular county. Here, all of the units in this social zone are tenured. What do I mean? If you are allocated social housing, then you are secure in that for life. You're tenured. You are secure in your occupancy of that social unit until you either die or you move away. Let's say another unit becomes available. Somebody dies or moves away, or a new building is built. So people will apply to occupy that available unit. They will apply to the county association, and that unit will be allocated through a lottery. Every applicant will have the same base probability. However, this base probability will be modified by an interview that you do with the county association. So if you have a good interview, your score will be a bit higher. If you have a bad interview, then maybe your score isn't higher at all. Also, your chance of getting that unit is inversely proportional to your per cap, i.e. the system is biased towards people who have less money and biased against people who have more money. The idea being that if you can afford commercial housing, then you should go there rather than social housing. Now let's look at the commercial zone. Commercial is split into residential and business. All commercial occupants pay rent to GCOMs, the local land authority, and this is done through the permanent auction subletting system. Let's look at that in detail. So let's look at a particular commercial property and its occupant. Let's say it's somebody living in a house in a commercial zone. So the occupant, like all occupants of commercial zones, has to pay a rent to GCOMs. So there's a few questions. Firstly, how is that rent decided? And also, how do we decide who gets to live in that commercial property? We'll answer those questions now. Every year, the occupant must self-declare the market value of that commercial property. They do this on a public listing of all properties in their region. So this is the PASS website, basically the GCOM's website, the local land authority website. This self-declaration of the market value is what determines how much rent they pay to GCOMs. So for example, here the occupant says, I think that this property is worth €100,000. The rent is a fixed fraction of whatever they declare. So here I use the number 25%. Therefore, the rent that they have to pay per year to GCOMs is €25,000. Right. But then you say, what stops the occupant from saying, I think that my house is worth 4 cents. And so my rent is going to be 25% of 4 cents. It's going to be 1 cent. Well, this is the answer. And it's also the answer to who gets to live in that commercial property or who gets to occupy it. A prospective occupant comes along and they are entitled to bid for that commercial property. There's a virtual bidding room on the PASS website. So let's say this person bids 80,000. I think that the property is worth 80,000. Well, that bid will be compared to the self-declared market valuation given by the current occupant, which is 100,000. In this case, the comparison is favorable to the current occupant because 100,000 euro is worth more than 80,000. So the current occupant gets to stay in the property and they continue to pay rent to GCOM. However, let's say that the occupant ups the ante. They say, I think that this property is worth 400,000 euro. Well, 400,000 euro is a bigger number than 100,000 euro. So now this person is the new occupant and they pay a rent to GCOMs. Their larger bid has secured them the occupancy of this commercial property. However, because their bid is so big, they now have to pay a very big rent. The rent was 25,000 before and now it's 100,000. So there's constantly a game between trying to bid high enough that you get the property, but low enough that your rent is kept low. Now, immigration. Immigration is not managed by the central state. Immigration is managed on a regional basis. And if a visa is granted to a migrant, they can apply for social housing like anybody else. I presume they can apply for commercial housing like anybody else also. So let's look at that. We have a prospective migrant. Rather than applying to the central state, they apply to Region 4, where they want to live. So they apply to County Association 4, which presides over Region 4. And the County Association will decide on their visa application. If they deny it, then the migrant doesn't move into Region 4. If they grant it, the migrant, if they so wish, can apply for social housing. This works like it does for any other resident of the country. There's a lottery, the base probability, which is modified by an interview. In this case, it would be a remote interview. International trade and development. Another now features a system of international economic institutions. The International Monetary Project, IMP, Cosmos, Currency Auctions Directorate, a couple of trade levies, and the International Redistribution and Development Depository, or IRDD. Let's discuss those in a minute, but I just want to say that this is more or less a new Bretton Woods. This is more or less what John Maynard Keynes proposed in the original Bretton Woods Conference of 1944. It's important to remember, though, that Keynes' proposals were rejected by the American delegation. So that's not what we ended up with. In any case, the International Monetary Project, IMP, has the purpose of balancing trade between states and funding sustainable development internationally. To this end, it uses the Cosmos. Each state has an account at the IMP, and the Cosmos is used as an accounting unit of international trade. Let's illustrate this with an example. Here we have State 1 and State 2, which want to trade with each other. So these could be actual states trading with each other, or they could be importers and exporters within those states. Anyway, let's say State 1 is Germany and State 2 is the United States. So Germany wants to purchase axes from the United States. How do they do this? Well, the axes are listed in dollars because they're produced in the US, and the importer in Germany has euros to spend because they're in Germany. So how is this exchange made? Well, the International Monetary Project converts the euros into Cosmos and then back into dollars. And this is done using some given exchange rates which the IMP sets. We're going to discuss this later, just ignore that for now. Now you might say, well, that's fine, but why can't you just convert the euros straight into dollars? Why does it need to go through this Cosmos thing? The answer is to keep track of international trade. So every state has an account at the IMP, and this account keeps track of the trade that each state does. Now, in order to do this in a sensible way, there has to be some universal unit to compare apples with apples. That's the function of the Cosmos. Without this universal unit of account, trade would have to be measured using all sorts of different currencies. So here we see State 1 has imported 200 Cosmos worth of goods, okay? 200 Cosmos worth of axes. And State 2 has exported 200 Cosmos worth of axes. So in this way, the IMP can keep track of how much each state is trading in terms of Cosmos. I just want to make a further remark on trade surpluses and deficits. Let's say this situation continued indefinitely, rather than just being one transaction. What we'd see, State 1 is in trade deficit, which means that it is importing more than it exports in terms of Cosmos. And State 2 is in trade surplus, which means it's exporting more than it's importing. And both of these states will be penalized, both the one in deficit and in surplus. We'll see this in more detail later. the Currency Auctions Directorate. So we saw there that there was an exchange rate between each currency and the cosmos. How are these exchange rates set? Well, this is done through something called the Currency Auctions Directorate, which is part of the International Monetary Project. Every day, states and private actors will be trying to buy and sell different currencies. And they do this through the Currency Auctions Directorate. So state 1, 2, 3, and 4 here are buying and selling euros, dollars, renminbi, pounds, etc. The job of the Currency Auctions Directorate is to set exchange rates between these currencies, okay, so between each currency and the cosmos, such that supply and demand for each currency is as close to matched as possible, i.e. that these exchange rates are market clearing prices. Now, we saw earlier that states will be penalized for being in trade surplus or in trade deficit. This is the trade imbalance levy. It happens automatically. The IMP deletes cosmos from that state's account at the IMP, and the levy will be in proportion to the magnitude of that trade deficit or the magnitude of that trade surplus. So let's illustrate that. We have the IMP, and it has a trade imbalance levy of 10% of the magnitude of the surplus or the deficit. Just to make this simple, we have state 2 only exporting, state 5 is only importing, and state 1, 3, and 4 are importing and exporting. And we say that state 1 imports as much as it exports, so does state 3, so does state 4. We say that they have balanced trade, they're in trade balance. Now, this means that state 2 has a trade surplus and state 5 has a trade deficit. So state 2 and state 5 will be penalized because they have a surplus and deficit in trade. So each of them will pay the trade imbalance levy to the IMP. So the IMP will delete cosmos from state 2's account at the IMP, and they'll delete cosmos from state 5's account at the IMP. How will this be calculated? Let's say that state 2 has a trade surplus of 100 cosmos, so they are exporting 100 cosmos more than they're importing. Then the levy will be 10 cosmos, and so 10 cosmos will be subtracted from their account at the IMP. Similarly, for state 5, which has a deficit of 100 cosmos, the levy will be 10 cosmos. There is another levy, which is the surge funding levy, and the point is to penalize excessive international financial flows across national borders. This again happens automatically. Again, the IMP deletes cosmos from that state's account at the IMP. The levy kicks in above a certain threshold, and the levy is proportional to that financial flow. So here we have state 1 and state 2. State 1 is transferring money into accounts in state 2. So there's a financial flow between state 1 and state 2. There's a surge funding levy, and this levy only kicks in above a certain threshold, which I have set at 150 cosmos per second. That's not necessarily how it actually happened. That's just the format that I chose for this illustration. Similarly, I set the levy to be 20% of the flow above that threshold. Now, the flow between state 1 and state 2 is 200 cosmos per second. So we can see that this is in excess of the threshold for the surge funding levy. So state 1 will be penalized. The flow between state 1 and state 2 is in excess of the levy by 50 cosmos per second. So at a levy of 20%, that means that 10 cosmos per second would be deleted from state 1's account at the IMP. If I understand this correctly, state 2 would not be penalized, but I'm not sure about that. I think state 2 isn't penalized because the reason that the surge funding levy is introduced is to avoid predatory financial flows where state 1, which is rich, funnels money very quickly into state 2, creating all sorts of bubbles, crashing the economy and then pulling out. Lastly, there's the International Redistribution and Development Depository, or IRDD. This is more or less a rejigged World Bank. The trade imbalance levy and the surge funding levy are directed into the IRDD. So if the trade levy removes 1 million cosmos from state 1, 1 million cosmos will then be put into the IRDD. Those funds are used for investment in the development of poorer regions, so that could be investment in poorer nation states or regions within a given nation state. Those would be investments in things like the green transition, public health, and so forth, and also investment into sustainable migration. So regions which grant visas to migrants could be entitled to some IRDD funding in order to make this a smooth process, in order to make this a process which is not economically detrimental to that region receiving migrants, but is economically neutral or economically beneficial. Something very important to note, because I said this was a rejigged World Bank, is that these are transfers, they're not loans. So these are just grants. The money is given, nothing is paid back, there's no interest. So to recap, we're going to bring all of these different institutions together into one graphic. So here we have a number of states and trading blocks, and they're engaged in trade with one another. And this trade is mediated through the International Monetary Project. State 3 has a trade deficit, and Trade Bloc 2 has a trade surplus. So they will be penalised for this with the Trade Imbalance Levy. State 1 has an excessive financial flow into State 2. So State 1 will pay the surge funding levy. In turn, these levies will flow into the IRDD, that rejigged World Bank which does transfers and not loans. So the IRDD will invest in poorer regions to promote sustainable development, and will invest in regions receiving migrants to promote sustainable migration. So we're at the end of the presentation now. What have we done? We've summarised the economic model of Another Now across the main headings of production units, regulation, finance, digital information, land, immigration, and international trade and development. And to summarise all of that in one diagram, we have all land publicly owned on a regional basis by these regional ground commons authorities, each of which is governed by a county association. We have immigration happening on a regional basis, where the county associations are making the decisions to grant or deny visas. We have the central bank playing an important role with its Jerome public payment system. We have each resident having a per cap account at the central bank divided into accumulation, legacy and dividend. We have a private credit system which uses this Jerome public payment system. We have local currencies and two taxes, a corporation tax and a land tax. We have production units split into a nationalised sector, a worker-owned sector and a domestic economy, and these production units regulated by social accountability juries. We have the use of data regulated by the Sovereign Data Fund and the Penny for Your Thought micropayment system. And lastly, we have trade being mediated by the International Monetary Project with its Cosmos unit of account and its levies, and the IRDD, which invests in development and in sustainable migration. I've tried to make this presentation as clear as possible, but there are a number of points in the book which are not clear to me. For example, does the dividend given by the central bank replace all welfare payments, for example, disability, pensions? Is there a job guarantee? That's not discussed. Again, given what I know about Varoufakis' politics, I assume that it's there, it's just never mentioned. I already asked about the role of public banking in investment. I raised some questions about nationalised utilities, what precisely is in this nationalised sector. I also raised a question about whether the social zone was only used for social housing, and many other questions, but I think the most appropriate place to deal with them is in an analysis video. So I would like to do a video analysing Another Now in future. This is only exposition, and material on other post-capitalist vision and analyses of those visions. Congratulations for making it this far. Your attention span hasn't yet been completely shredded into useless pieces of confetti. If you liked this video, then click like and subscribe to show support to the channel. It only takes a second. I tried to make high quality content, so I want people to actually see that. If you like the channel, please recommend it to others who like this kind of thing. Do leave a comment. I'm genuinely interested in hearing your thoughts, including constructive criticism. I hope to gradually build a community around this channel where we can have illuminating discussions and learn from each other. And be aware that there's an After the Oligarchy blog associated with this YouTube channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon. This is After the Oligarchy signing off. The only future for humanity is one after the oligarchy.